Sleepy Hollow. You've probably heard of it in media and books and movies and TV shows, and that's thanks to the famous Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, which has inspired all kinds of adaptations that you've probably heard of. But did you know Sleepy Hollow is a real place? Well, you probably have if you clicked this video. But what's really interesting is that almost all the locations in the short story are real places, or used to be real places. So we're going to take you to as many of these places as we can, and show you where they are and what they look like now. So just a quick recap, if you don't know or remember the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it follows the story of Ichabod Crane, an interesting looking and behaving man who moves in from Connecticut to become the new schoolmaster. He, as well as the other residents, enjoy the beauty and serenity of the area, even though they all believe it's haunted by the ghost of the Headless Horseman. The story culminates when Ichabod is chased around town by what appears to be the Headless Horseman, but is most likely his rival, Brom Bones. He passes all these scary things and eventually disappears forever. Okay, you could read the legend or summary yourself, but that's the gist of it. Okay, now let's give an overview of these locations. First of all, the story refers to the Hudson River, the Tappan Zee, and towns with the name Greensburg, Tarrytown, and Sleepy Hollow. So let's start with the Hudson River. That's this. It's a very wide river that flows 315 miles south from the Adirondacks to New York City, and it's a tidal estuary as far north as Troy. However, this 9-mile stretch of river from the Piermont Marsh to Croton Point is the second widest part of the river, colloquially known as the Tappan Zee. The name Tappan refers to the sub-tribe of the Lenape people of the area, and Zee is the Dutch word for sea. Most people know of this section of the river due to the Tappan Zee Bridge, which spanned this wide portion of the river for over 50 years, and many consider the current bridge by the same name. Then, Tarrytown, which is one word, is a current village in New York. I actually rated it the third nicest village to visit in New York in my most watched video. It's pretty much the center of the cultural region known as the River Towns in southern Westchester County. Now in New York, all parts of land are either parts of cities or towns, and within each town, there can also be smaller municipalities called villages. So the town of Greenburg, without the S, contains the village of Tarrytown, as well as 5 other villages. Greenburg is the 12th biggest town in the state by population, and the 4th biggest outside of Long Island. And last in this list, the legend refers to Sleepy Hollow itself as a little valley, or sequestered glen, just to the north, perhaps as a part of the community of Tarrytown, but somewhat separate. The village incorporated in 1874 under the name North Tarrytown, for obvious reasons. But then in 1996, the village voted to change its name to Sleepy Hollow in honor of its history. In some ways, the village just feels like a northern suburb to Tarrytown, but in reality, the village does have its own downtown, although it's in the same semi-urban zone as Tarrytown's downtown. And then, it also has a few of its own distinct residential neighborhoods, like Phillips Manor and Sleepy Hollow Manor, so in my opinion, it definitely deserves to be its own village. Now, the legend describes Sleepy Hollow as about 2 miles north of Tarrytown, which is inaccurate. It's more like 1 mile. And specifically, the legend says Sleepy Hollow is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. So the little valley being referred to is actually north of downtown Sleepy Hollow, and the valley itself is created by the brook that's mentioned, and in the legend, that brook goes unnamed, but I'll tell you the name right now. It's the Pocantico River. This river runs from Echo Lake in the town of Newcastle to its mouth 14 miles south at the Hudson River in Sleepy Hollow. It's also apparently extremely polluted, as industry has had its way. In fact, the mouth of the river was rerouted in the 1920s to make room for a General Motors plant at Sleepy Hollow's waterfront. Now, it's hard to see on the map, but just northwest of where US 9 meets New York 448, there's a large elevation drop down into this valley, so more on that later. Now, the only thing we really don't know is where Ichabod Crane's schoolhouse was. Any internet searches will result in the Ichabod Crane Schoolhouse in Kinderhook, in Columbia County, 90 miles north, and apparently that's where Jesse Merwin, the inspiration for Ichabod Crane and acquaintance of author Washington Irving, taught. but it has nothing to do with the actual schoolhouse from the legend. The only information given was that this schoolhouse was at the foot of a woody hill and near a brook and birch tree. Well, that sorta narrows it down. I hypothesize that it's on the Pocantico River, probably not too far from civilization, so probably somewhere around here. Next, perhaps the most iconic spots in the legend are the Old Dutch Church and churchyard, and these still exist right here. The church was built in the 17th century, and the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery sits just to the north. The Old Dutch churchyard has very old gravestones with some names wearing away. And of the names you still can see, you'll see a lot of the namesakes for local streets in the nearby towns. So all of this has become a big tourist spot, including the surrounding cemetery, which I'd still say is the most interesting cemetery I've ever been to. Some of the famous names there are Andrew Carnegie, William Rockefeller, and, you guessed it, Washington Irving. People are always walking around and exploring at all times of the year, especially in the fall. Now, just a few more locations before we map out the final chase. The legend references the mill pond next to the church, and here it is. It's part of the Phillipsburg Manor attraction, featuring the house and mill from the pre-Revolutionary War manor, which covered a large chunk of present-day Westchester County. The current property is a museum now. Then, as for the location of the Van Tassel estate, where Ichabod begins his final journey from, the Visit Sleepy Hollow website claims that it was at the present-day corner of Broadway and Hamilton Place in Tarrytown Village. That's apparently where the Elizabeth Van Tassel house was, and now it's this, the Landmark Condominium, of course. Now, this location does check out based on the other locations mentioned. For instance, the legend references a spot near a brook where Major John Andre from the Revolutionary War was captured, right by the giant tulip tree known as Major Andre's Tree. Well, the tree no longer exists, but there is a monument and a quaint park that straddles a village line between Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow that's now called Patriots Park. And the brook running right through it is now called the Andre Brook, and it actually forms the village line between Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow for a while. Nowadays, the brook flows underground for most of its course, but it reappears right at the Tarrytown waterfront. And one last thing before we move on, the legend talks about this area being thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Sounds like the type of thing you'd see in a legend like this, except these are actually real. More on that later. So now for the most important part of the video, we're going to map out the final chase between Ichabod and the Headless Horseman, starting with where Ichabod left the Van Tassel estate, so I'm at the Landmark Condominium now. Now, I could walk it, but it would take too long, so I'm on my bike here. We're about a half block north of where Main Street meets Broadway, and it's also a Sunday morning in October, so we're gonna miss most of the traffic. So like Ichabod, we now take off from the Van Tassel estate, or at least the location of it, and we head north on Broadway. Ichabod was residing at the time at the Van Ripper house, and using the Van Ripper's horse, Gunpowder. It's somewhere not overly downhill, so I'm guessing it's somewhere here on the map. This definitely isn't rural anymore, as there are storefronts on the left and right. So nowadays, US 9, also known as Broadway, makes traveling north and south quite easy. Yeah, the commercial parts ended that light over there near the library and on the right, Seatown. Downstate New Yorkers will know that brand. And we're technically still in the village of Tarrytown, but even the legend describes this as a small port and market town. And then everything turns green, as on the right you have the middle school and high school campus, and on the left you have Patriots Park. And over there you can see the Village of Sleepy Hollow sign. And here's the site of Andre's Tree, and you can see the monument where he was captured here. Now let's head into Patriots Park, and over here you can then see where the Andre Brook is. The legend says this area was haunted, or more specifically, the common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tale of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. There also used to be a swamp here, known in the legend as Wiley's Swamp, but it doesn't exist anymore, and again, the brook it was part of is almost entirely below ground now. Now right here is also the spot where Ichabod and the Headless Horseman come face to face. Now there are a few nicely designed bridges over the brook in this park, but those are clearly not the bridges from the legend. So the chase is on, as Ichabod and Gunpowder took off north. Well, this is Beekman Avenue, the main street in Sleepy Hollow. Safe to say this didn't exist in the legend. The village boomed in the 1920s when General Motors made their plant on the waterfront, which is currently being redeveloped. And now, Sleepy Hollow has about 10,000 residents, just about 2,000 short of Tarrytown itself. Now we get to an interesting spot. Broadway, or US 9, takes a sharp turn to the left down the hill, while there are roads going straight and to the right. The legend says at some point after the Andre Brook, Ichabod reaches the road that turns off to Sleepy Hollow, which I presume is Route 448, which heads uphill to the hamlet of Pocantico Hills. But his horse seemed to unexpectedly take a sharp left turn and plunge downhill towards the church, so that means it followed present-day Broadway. This is what leads me to guess the region where the Van Ripper house was. Yeah, due to the position of this hill, all you're really getting is gas stations or auto shops or small office buildings to the right here. And also, at some point in this stretch, Ichabod lost the saddle. And now Broadway bends back north. At the bottom of the hill, then you can see Phillipsburg Manor to the left. If you enter the property, you can see the actual houses and mill pond. Now, according to the legend, Ichabod was led to believe that once he crossed the bridge over the Pocantico River, he'd be safe, because the horsemen would magically disappear, according to the legend that Brom Bones told him in the story. And then on the right, you can see the Headless Horseman statue, and it's pretty representative of what happens in the legend, as you see the horsemen catching up to Ichabod. And then a couple hundred feet north of that, you get to this little crossing of the Pocantico River, where the historical posts call it, if you will, the Headless Horseman Bridge, but it's clearly not the location of the actual bridge. The actual spot of this bridge is more to the east, as even Irving himself wrote at the end that the road was altered, perhaps due to the superstition of that bridge, and it was moved, quote, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. Now inside the cemetery, there's another bridge crossing the Pocantico River, which many people say is more representative of the appearance of the bridge in the legend. But that's considerably upriver of the spot too, so it's somewhere in between. But surely it's very close to the church, so somewhere around here. So Ichabod crossed the river right around the spot in front of the church and churchyard, and then turned back to see if the Headless Horseman would disappear. But instead, the horseman took its head that was disconnected from his body and fired it at Ichabod, knocking him off his horse, and Ichabod was never seen again. At least so the legend says. Now, it's quite clear that it was actually Brom Bones who was a Headless Horseman, and that his head was actually a pumpkin, and that Ichabod didn't actually disappear, he just left town immediately, but you never know. Now, what I really like about coming here is that you could also stay on Broadway, where you can see, you guessed it, the scary overhanging trees. Well, these trees actually also overhang the cemetery road too. I've never seen trees like that anywhere in the northeastern United States. So let me know in the comments if you know of anywhere else that has that. I know there's some in Savannah, Georgia, but that's really far away. And then, of course, you could easily continue into the rest of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. And I already talked about it before. It's just an intriguing place, absolutely. The cemetery does tours also, of course. And just so you know, this chase was exactly 1 mile long. So even if you don't bike, it's an easy walk. And there are so many gems all around the area. Now lastly, tourist websites and even the I Heart New York commercials talk about Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow as the place to go explore around the Halloween season, due to its reputation of being haunted, or being the inspiration for scary stories. Honestly though, and I speak from an objective standpoint, I really don't notice any difference in the culture here near Halloween. Sure, decorations change a little, and there supposedly are some events, but I've lived nearby for nearly my whole life, and I've never seen anything major taking place here around Halloween. So, you can make your own fun, I guess. We do have a number of tour buses coming in today though. The fall colors are excellent here, but that's pretty much just like the rest of the Northeast. So you don't really need the gimmick of Halloween to make this place worthwhile to visit. But now I ask you, have you been to Sleepy Hollow? Have you explored any of these sites? What do you think? Is this place haunted? Is this place worth all the hype? And even if you're not into all the legend hype, do you still like coming to Sleepy Hollow? Is it a nice place? Or the area? I'd like to hear what you think. Thank you for watching.